Hello, this is Jim Sim with the Midwest Pipe Band Association, and welcome to our series of piping and drumming experts and educational and historical topics. Today we have the great Reid Maxwell from Vancouver, British Columbia, Canada. Reid and I, we were just discussing, go back a long time into the early 80s, and I can really call Reid a true friend. And Reid, thank you very much for being with us today.
Jim, thank you. And yes, you are a true friend indeed, all the way back to the very early 80 days. Alma Highland Games, I do believe, was probably the first time.
I think you're right. A long time ago.
Yes, absolutely.
Hey, maybe we can get started with basically telling us how you got started in drumming and maybe who your first instructors were.
So when I started in drumming, I lived in Cardenden, a very small little place in Fife, close to Kirkcaldy or Dunfermline, for those of you who might be slightly aware of the geographic setup of the area. So anyway, I grew up in Cardenden, specifically in a little area of Cardenden called Bowhill. And for as long as I can remember, I always wanted to play drums. I was never interested in pipes. I was always fascinated by how cool it was that drummers played with pipes and they played tunes or scores. Or, of course, I didn't know what they were back then. I just wanted to play drums in a pipe band. And so a really interesting story of how I got started would be that my granny was very keen on having me start as a drummer. And so my cousin played bagpipes in one of the local bands. And I say bands because there was two bands in Cardenden. There was one in Bowhill, and then there was one further away from where I lived in Dundonald called the Dysart and Dundonald Pipe Band. And so my cousin James played pipes in the Dysart and Dundonald Pipe Band, and he came and picked me up to take me up to Dundonald to get my first lessons. Now, what was interesting about that is en route to the Dundonald practice to learn as a kid, you had to walk past the hall of the Bowhill Pipe Band. So I was actually walking further, and the only reason I did that was because James played pipes there, and he was going to take me and get me started because obviously it was the band and they were looking for young guys. Now, unbeknown to me at that time, it was the greatest thing that ever happened. I met a guy called Willie Bell, William Bell, or Willie Bell. Willie, he's been a lifelong friend to this day, still a lifelong friend, great guy. And he taught me. And so he used to live across the street about 100 yards away from my granny's house. And many's a day I would spend time there in between regular band practice sessions. But if my cousin James had played pipes in the Bowhill and Seafield Pipe Band, I might have ended up there, and I'm not really sure what would have happened. I mean, it's all fate. But I think that along the way, everybody has an element of luck that sort of comes their way. And this guy that you see here has definitely been the luckiest guy in the pipe band world in terms of where he's always managed to land his feet and maybe take advantage of an opportunity that was presented. But that's how I got started as a little guy in the village of Cardenden, playing in the Dysart and Dundonald Band. And now at that time, the Dysart and Dundonald Band had a junior band called the Ballingry High School Pipe Band. And that was it was run from Ballingry School because Bob Shepherd, the great Bob Shepherd, was a math teacher at Ballingry School. And so he recruited people from the high school and around the area of the high school in Ballingry, and then also in the Greater Cardenden area, which back in those days would have had a population of maybe about 5,000 people, you know. And so we would all go there and they would come down on Fridays and stuff like that. So that's how I got my start.
And then to take it a step further, I think it's well known that you may be the only person I know of anyway, that has won world championships with 3 different bands on 2 different continents. And obviously with Dysart and Dundonald when you played with James King, and then with the 78th Fraser Highlanders, and then of course SFU. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that journey
Well, if there's one thing about the early days when I played with the Dysart band, I was just a teenager, you know, and so at that time, all I wanted to do was play drums. I just wanted to play drums in a band, and I didn't really appreciate the magnitude of the accomplishments that were actually happening at that time. You know, like winning the best drum corps prize at the Worlds in 1975 as a 14-year-old high school student. You know, and then managing to do that 3 years in a row. You know, and then winning the Worlds with Dysart and Dundonald in 1977 for the very first time, and I mean, it was amazing. The only thing I can remember is it's the first time I remember myself being all choked up and crying and looking around, and everybody in the band was doing the same. They were all crying. We were all. It was kind of like, and sort of not really, because I was young and didn't really know any better. You were wondering why everybody and yourself were crying more so than anything else, because it was kind of like a weird experience, you know. So you know, life's all about experiences, really, isn't it? And but I certainly loved those days, and they were the making of me as a player, a person, and a musician. I'd like to think that people think me as a musician. And so those years at my early start were, you know, like you couldn't ask to be in a better position, you know, like playing in a band like that from a little tiny village in, you know, in Fife of all places. So I emigrated in 1981 in September, Labor Day weekend, actually, of 1981. I emigrated to Toronto, and by the spring of '82, I had joined the 78th Fraser Highlanders. I had gone to a rehearsal that they had in the fall when they were still called General Motors Pipe Band. And sometime over the course of being there for a visit in sort of October, and when I actually joined the band in sort of like March, April, they had become the 78th Fraser Highlander bands, basically through a sponsorship, really. So I joined the band there, and then at the end of the '82 season, I was made the lead drummer of the band. And then the rest, I guess you could say, in some ways, is some old '80s history. Met you, I got to play in Ontario. It was part of a tremendous accomplishment. Again, very lucky, really. I mean, lucky that of all the bands, the 78 Fraser Highlanders were looking to improve their drumming entity of their band. I had just immigrated, and on I went. You know, just luck. As I say, the luckiest guy in the entire world when it comes to being in the right place at the right time. And so I got one of the great things about the 78 Fraser Highlanders and working with Bill Livingston, the pipe major, and to a certain extent, a young Michael Gray, Bruce Gandy, John Walsh, was that I was given the freedom to do anything. They just do. You do your thing, if it fits and we can make it all work, then that's really, really good. So you could say that there was lots of trials and errors along the way, but anything that I sort of was inspired to do from the heart or the gut, I would just do it. And out of that came all that great music that, you know, a lot of people, I mean, people still talk about the Live in Ireland album from '87 as being quite an influential album. To think that I would have been as large a part of that project as I was, when I reflect back of it, it's kind of wild, you know. And so I played with the 78 for a few years, from 1982, which was my first season, through to 1990. My last competition with them would have been the Silver Jubilee RSPBA contest that was held the Sunday, the day after the World Pipe Band Championships in 1990. And then I ended up at SFU. So I got a phone call from Terry Lee sometime right after the World Pipe Band Championships in 1992, I had been over playing with the Peel Regional Police Pipe Band, Pipe Major Tom Anderson, playing in the Grade 2 and having a great time there, playing with lots of students that I had from the Toronto area at that time. And I got a phone call from Terry and says, there's rumours abound that you're moving to the West Coast. And I said to him, I said, well, they're only rumours. I said, but it sounds really interesting. We should keep talking. We should keep talking. So we did. And then over the span of about 4 weeks, we talked about how we could make this work and how we could do it. And then I ended up joining the band. And then I would say 9 months after I joined the band, we played at the Worlds. 1993 would have been my first year with SFU. And then in basically just roughly about 12 months after I had officially became the lead drummer of SFU, I moved to the West Coast. I moved to the Vancouver area, and I've been in Vancouver ever since. It's very much home, and I've been part of, the band for, well, quite a long time now. It's coming up on 30 years. I've been a member of the SFU pipe band, and I love it here. I've helped to start the Robert Malcolm Memorial Pipe Band, which is our sort of young kids development. Come along, have fun. If you want to get more serious, we can help you along the way. And I started a drumming school that then became a piping and drumming school that I run with Jack Lee now, called Piping Hot Summer Drummer. It's the largest piping and drumming school in the world, and it's held right here in the middle of, pretty much in the middle of nowhere in British Columbia. So that's sort of five hours due east and ever so slightly north of where I live. But yeah, I love it, and love playing in the band. Many highlights there along the way. I'm sure you'll remember an early spring day in April of 1996 when the world champion SFU pipe band came to Chicago to play a concert, conduct a weekend-long series of workshops, and record our very first live album called Alive in America. So,
I do indeed. I remember most of it anyway.
Yeah. That's great.
Yeah. So moving on then to, now that you've given the cliff notes of your entire life, when you're adjudicating, things we're looking for, maybe in the lower grades in particular, what bands do, what they don't do, and how they can improve. So when you're adjudicating a grade 5 contest, let's say a quick march medley, what are you looking for from the drum corps? What do you want to hear, and what are things maybe you do hear that you don't want to hear?
I would say still to this day, I hear a bit of this, not nearly as much as we would have heard, let's say 20 years ago, but I still hear people playing mass band scores, or a variation of a mass band score where they play a little thing and then they play a middle cadence and then they play a little cadence and then they play an ending cadence. It doesn't really fit the tune. And I find that to be, I find that that's very disrespectful to the music, because the music is incredible. Even if you're playing little marches, I wrote a score back in the summer for a tune that I've known my entire life called Killicranky, a little 4-parted march. And I think when the last time I might have heard that in competition, and somebody charging through playing the mass band 4/4 score to that and trying to fathom where they thought that fit that tune, and
Yep.
So I hear a lot of grade 5 bands still trying to do that. Maybe bands in the lower grades, not just grade 5, but maybe 4 and 3 for that matter, maybe biting off more than they can chew, like trying to play too much, and scores they are busy, or for example, I think this still goes on today, bands that get promoted to 5 to 4 and the pipers decide to keep a couple of tunes, and so the drummers decide that they're going to make the scores more technical. Okay, well, how's that? Well, I don't, and I think it's they're going after the wrong thing. Why don't you just keep the score the way you are and play it maybe even better because your skill set's going up, because people will really appreciate that, you know? Like when I'm working with the young kids that I teach on a weekly, bi-weekly, monthly basis, whatever, I'm always telling them, I want you to be accurate and smooth. Accurate and smooth, you know? And I think that we lose, we need to be more focused on the music. And I would go as far as saying, from a drumming perspective, and I think as a drummer, and you, of course, being an excellent drummer yourself, will know this, that I think that it's important that people gravitate to the music more so than just playing drums. To me, it's always been about the music of it all, and the other things will take care of itself. I've always sort of been an admirer of the ensemble prize because it does break the tie.
Yes.
But you can't have a tremendously ensemble generated performance without the drumming itself being great, you know? And I think that along the way, sometimes we lose perspective of that. And, you know, like what makes things more complex, more notes? I don't really get that, you know? I can say that there's 2 albums and performances from those albums that I hold dear to my composition approach to this day. One was an album by the City of Glasgow Police Pipe Band, okay, under Ronnie Laurie. Lead drummer would have been Alec Connell at the time. And I always remember a March to Spain reel on that album that started with the march, Brigadier General Ronald Cheap of Terrorin. And Alec Connell's score at that time, now when I was into this, I wasn't even a teenager, but I remember how I used to think that that was one of the most amazing tunes and compositions for whatever reason. I can't tell you, but it always blew me away. And then an album that came out several years later, but in the early 70s, before I started to play with the Dysart band, was a band called Accordions and Brass with the Pipes. And it was put out by the great Shotson Dykehead, pipe major Tom McAllister, lead drummer Alec Dysart. And there's a drum score on there that's played to the great 4/4 march, Peter Mackenzie Warren.
With the Hills of Alva. Yep.
And it's got that, yeah. So the Peter Mackenzie Warren 4/4 and the Hills of Alva, there's quite there's similarities in those scores. And I would say that when people ask me about Alec Dysart's material, I would say, Peter Mackenzie Warren, that is the absolute greatest composition ever. It's just unbelievable. And I remember when I was a young guy, I would be pre-high school and listening to the Shots warming up at the World Pipe Band Championships in 1973, getting ready to go on to play Peter Mackenzie Warren, opening tune of the medley. And then later on that day, they were crowned world champions. Go figure. And those pieces of music always stuck with me. And so you'll get a laugh at this. Being my age, I'm blessed with getting to play with some amazing young talent in the SFU corps. No more so than my son Grant. And every now and again, they'll ask me if I'm going to put any of the old school stuff in some of these drum scores that are coming up. You know, like they look at me, old school. You know, like, oh, what do you mean? What do you mean? Like, oh, come on, Dad, put some of that old school stuff in. And then the other guys will chirp in and, yeah, come on, JR, put some of that. You know, it's like, what? But you know, when I do scores up like that, let's say we've got a concert project and we're putting something together and I air that way, the guys love that.
Yeah.
They absolutely love how that would be about. And the fact that I can recall stuff that I heard in the 60s, saw in the 70s, and stuff I did in the 70s because I played in the 70s in grade 1. And you know, so it's kind of a good personal resource base to have in my head, that all that information, you know. I mean, I'm probably the biggest drum geek in the world when it comes to pipe band, or certainly challenging for that title probably every year, you know, because I just love the stuff. But yeah.
So basically, you could basically say that something simple played very well and with musical feel is much better than something played with a lot of difficulty and technical stuff.
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I mean, how do you know it's easy when something's good? Is that, you know, like when something's good, I just put the clipboard under my arm,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and just listen. It's like, oh my God, that's so good. And I would say, Jim, you know, when you're judging, when something's so good, you just go, oh my God, that's so good. And then when something's not good, you're trying to figure out, why is it that this is not good? And so you're not listening as intently to things because you're trying. I'd like to try and put something helpful down on the sheet. I always find in the lower grades, grades 5, 4, and into 3, that sometimes it's that score here is an overreach, you know, and untidy. You need to scale it back a little bit. It doesn't need to be this complex, you know. And I think words of encouragement like that, when something's messy, you're 99% of the time it's because they're trying to play stuff that's over their head. And when something is simple, you never notice it because it's just so well played. It's so good.
And that reaches into a lot of the aspects, I think, too. You would agree that in the grades 3, 4, 5, all the grades, things that can be fixed, a lot of times it's a package of basic things, playing to the beat, playing with good phrasing definition, things like that kind of bring the whole package together and form that glue instead of just trying to play difficult things all the time.
Yeah. People, I know that this gets said about my drum compositions, and it has been said about my drum compositions for a long time. And it is that the Maxwell stuff, it's not very hard. It's not very technically challenging. And so people ask me about that, you know, they'll say, so what do you think about that? I said, well, I don't know what's difficult. And they'll kind of look at me and I'll say, well, you know, I mean, if I take the mass band scores and I reverse the sticking and say that everything on the top line is now on your left hand and everything on the bottom hand is on your right, does that make it difficult or does it make it awkward? And by deliberately making it awkward, has that just been silly, kind of stupid, irrelevant? What is that? You know, it's like, I don't understand what difficulty has to do with anything or simplicity. It's just whatever you use to get your point across. I know from writing drum score from that perspective, it's easier to write a score for the SFU grade 1 pipe band than it is to write a march for the opening of the grade 4 band medley. Because in the grade 1 band, I just write anything, hand it out to the guys and they play it. But in the grade 4 band, well, I have to go to my grade 4 band of tricks, and it's just a little bag. It's a little bag. And you've got to carefully know how to use those rudiments so that they can all play them and play them well. And so it's much harder. And I don't know if people think, if people actually realize that it's harder to write scores for grade 5 and 4 and 3 than it is for grades 1 and 2. I mean, grade 1's, you can stick anything in, you know, but if you've got a little bunch, let's say I've got a raw group, you know, they're getting ready for their first year to play in grade 4. Well, what are you going to get them to play? It's like, and then to be able to give them a sense that they can play together and stuff like that. It's, you know, it can be quite challenging to write a score at that level, you know, but there seems to be a lot of experts.
You really have to know your audience at that point, don't you? I mean, you have to play to the players.
Absolutely. Making sure that they're learning things along the way, the right things, and that they're doing the basic things really, really well. Your foundation has to be really good. I always kind of say that from a drumming perspective, you should always be able to relate everything back to 5 common things: a buzz, a tap, a double, a paradiddle, and a triplet. So if somebody's having a problem, you could go to one of those 5 things and say, oh, now watch that wee 13-stroke roll there, your buzz, that little da-da, you're too heavy there on the right hand, watch that. And so if you can't relate it back to those 5, then you have an issue, right? Because you can't, the learner doesn't know what you're talking about. It's kind of like math in school, you know, that the lowest common denominator. I just think that kind of makes sense. And so I like to be able to take things back, because once you get past those things, you know, like you can't play a flamadiddle until you learn a paradiddle, and then you learn how to play a flam and you stick it on. It's like, you know, there's a little process along the way. So I think that's important. And then one of the things that I like to encourage is that once you've got your base and you add to it all your basic things, and then you get your first scores, all you're doing is making your foundation thicker and stronger, and you keep bringing it with you. You don't leave it behind like, oh, well, that was what we did last year, and then go on. You bring the knowledge of your learnings with you. You know, like I could still remember sitting around this. I remember sitting around the school desks at Ballingry School when scores were getting made up and people were chucking ideas in. And I can remember sometimes, I can remember things that went on round about the table and how this went. And sometimes that can be helpful when you're stuck yourself. I know you must have been there as many times as I have over the years, where you've got a wee bit of writer's block. And so what do you draw on when you're getting writer's block? Well, you can throw the sticks on the floor and charge out the room and say, that's it, I can't do it anymore. Or you think, okay, let me think about this. And then you start to tap into things that would have happened before. Well, you know, like sometimes I think, even though I never had any formal lessons, I think often about how Alec Dysart would approach it, and try to think about how he would have approached it when he was writing things like The Hills of Alva, Peter Mackenzie Warren, and other great compositions as Maggie Cameron and stuff like that. I think, what would he have been thinking at that time? And then, of course, I think about James King, because he was the lead drummer of the band, and some of the kind of off-the-wall things that James would have done just to kind of like move away from the fact that we were going this way, but we weren't getting anywhere going that way. And so he would all of a sudden go, it's like, oh my God. But that's helpful to be able to do that, you know?
Yeah.
So I find that stuff to be important. If that
I agree.
answers.
And then keeping that lower grade performance in your mind, if you're adjudicating or listening, what about the bass and the tenors? What are you listening for there? I think we could both say something about what annoys us, but what are you looking for from the bass and the tenor section in the lower grades?
Well, this will annoy some of the pure drummers, but maybe the people beyond that will appreciate this comment, and that is that I am a drummer in a pipe band. That should tell you in itself that pipe, or music that's generated by the pipes, the bagpipes, is first. And so everything that I want to do is to enhance the melody. So when I'm writing the snares chart, I'm trying to fit it. And then when it's the bass and the tenor, it's got to sit with what the pipe is playing. One of the things that absolutely grates me, because I hear it instantly, and I guess you would probably put this into integration, but for example, let's say you're playing Scotland the Brave. I'll use that as an example because I think everybody will know the melody. Brum, brum, ba-dum, bum, ba-dum. Okay, so there's your first bar. So why are bass drummers in bands allowed to play ha da 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 da? Because I thought the bass line was brum brum ba-dee bum ba-dum ba. I don't believe you should be playing notes to tunes and scores like that where there's no melodic note. And space, isn't space? You know, like if you want to confuse a teenager, Jim, you look them in the eye and say, you know, the space between the notes is every bit as important as the notes themselves. It's amazing what kind of a blank stare you get back when you see that to a teenager. It's unbelievable. But they don't understand space. Now, even a run of 30-second notes, if there's no space, there's no clarity. You know, and if you're playing to Scotland the Brave, the melody comes out because the space, there's space in the melody line. It's the way the notes are spaced that gives you your melodic line. And so we should be doing our best to enhance that. And then when the tenors are playing, they should be highlighting the things that the snare drummers are doing. So maybe they're playing out some of the accents, you know, maybe they're hitting the odd flam and stuff like that. But I think it also needs to be done in a tasteful way so that they're not doing it all the time in every phrase. There needs to be a space for all of it to belong. I think it would, maybe the best word would be balance. It needs to have balance. In a drum corps, in a pipe band, you want to hear the pipes. You want to hear the support from the drum corps. In the drum corps, you want to hear the snares, but you want to hear how the bass and tenor are working together to lift what the snares are doing, which in itself is lifting what the pipes are doing. You know, I always say the music is a gift, and the snare drum is the wrapping paper. The bass drum is the ribbon that you tie around it, and the tenor drum score is the name tag, so that on Christmas morning, you know who's getting that present. It's pretty straightforward. Now, when the ribbon, the wrapping paper, and the name tag become more important than the present, you have a problem.
Right. Very well put. So I guess we could sum up by saying play within your capabilities at the right volume level with a good dynamic effect on the beat with good music. Period.
Excellent.
Well, we just solved all those problems.
Yeah. So yeah, I just think that listen to the music. One of the things about the whole musical aspect of things, Jim, I've sort of gotten more into this in the last 3 or 4 years. And I don't know why I didn't get into it earlier. It's just one of those things that I don't think I was looking for that. And one of the things I try to do as a teacher is I try to improve all the time. I'm trying to, how can I improve? How can I teach better? And so one of the things that I've been on for the last 4, maybe 5 years is, how do you teach someone in Chicago, Illinois, how to play a drum score to this thing called Scotland the Brave? They'll be going, Scotland the Brave, what? Is that like a Braveheart movie? Is that Mel Gibson's new thing? That's what they think. And they think like that in Canada too. Okay, so if you're, you know, picking up, if you're in Toronto, Chicago, what? What's Scotland the Brave? Now, here's one thing that you don't have to do to a 7-year-old, 8-year-old in Scotland. You don't need to tell them how Scotland the Brave goes, because they would know by the time they get 7, 8 years old, probably sing you the words. Now, one of the things that I've been doing is I've been trying to use songs, nursery rhymes, and sculpt drum scores to them so that people who are not Scottish can understand how we put scores together to melody. Old MacDonald Has a Farm. Absolutely, probably the most universally known tune that people can play to, you know? And so I'm trying to use that aspect of learning so that you're putting all those rudiments that you would use in a Scotland the Brave. Okay, how do I hook some person who doesn't even know that Scotland the Brave? They might know that there's this place called Scotland because their great-great-grandfather moved from Scotland back in the day, you know, but that's the only connection. So trying to use songs and or tunes that they could play to that would then open the door so that when you show them this little thing called Scotland the Brave or the Green Hills, it's like, oh, okay, so this is a Scottish tune and it's got the same thing. So it's trying to wedge that gap, because there is a gap. It's a cultural gap, you could say, but it's a gap that exists, and it's trying to fill that in a way. Because really, when we have youngsters, we're trying to lure them, aren't we? I always think it's like, let's get a big old fat juicy worm in here and get them going. And then, but once you've got them, it's like, oh, you've got them. But it's trying to get them.
That's an interesting concept, because typically I think young drummers are taught to a time signature pattern rather than a melodic pattern.
Right.
And this way you're locking them into that melodic feel right from the start.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I mean, you know, people often compliment me, and probably the nicest compliment I ever get is people, I will say, Reid, I like the way you play to the music. Where do you get that from? And if I had to pinpoint that, I would say that my granny was the person who instilled that in me from the time I was like 4 or 5 years old. In her house, it was Jimmy Shand, Andy Stewart, Kenneth McKellar, Moira Anderson, and then eventually the Corries and stuff like that. And so I was hearing tunes, songs, mainly songs, except when it was Jimmy Shand on the accordion. I was hearing songs, okay? Now, I mentioned to you earlier about going to my very first band or my very first drum practice when I was a wee guy, my cousin James taking me up to the local band hall. I can tell you 2 things I can remember about that like it was last week. Nobody in the pipe band had their kilt on. Now, when you're, I've never seen anybody play pipes without their kilt on. I was horrified. I was like shocked. But the pipers and drummers were playing A Scottish Soldier, which of course is the Green Hills. I could not wait to get home and tell my granny that the pipers and drummers were playing that song. So, because I grew up with it. Okay. And I'm just getting ready to hand out music tomorrow night, for example, to the grade 4 band. They're learning a wee march medley as a little subset thing that they're working on. And the new 2/4 march that we're adding to this wee tune is Mary's Wedding. Well, I knew that step, we gaily on we go, heel for heel. I knew that as a song because my granny played it. She sang it. She would try and teach me to sing it. And so that's where I got all that from. My granny was not a music. I mean, I stood next to my granny in the church, and I can also tell you that she couldn't really sing very well either. But that didn't stop her instilling in me the music. And I didn't think about it when you're young, and you don't realize that at the time. But when you're older now and you can reflect back on stuff, I can reflect back on saying that it was my surroundings that gave me the opportunity to think about the music. I don't really think about things in time. I think about the music. You know?
That's a great concept. And that's a great segue. I wanted to ask you, when you get a young drummer comes to the organization, wants to learn drums, and he's 7 or 8 years old, what is kind of where you start them, and then where do you progress to from there?
So I teach basically everything that I was taught, but the process is different. Okay, so for example, I know that we would have been taught by different people the same way. I remember when we were taught rolls, Jim, after we played a few things, we would be taught to play a 5 and then a 7, a 9, a 13, 3-pace roll. It's basically in that order. But here's what we were always taught. We were always taught in a numerical structure. So we were taught 5-stroke rolls because 5 comes before 7. And we were taught 7s because, well, 7 comes before 9. But now that I've had the chance to study how I teach, and I continue to do that on a weekly basis, why would you teach the 5-stroke roll first when it's the hardest? Why would you not teach them the easiest roll? For example, if you've been coming to band for a wee while and you've maybe got an older brother or sister that's playing in the band, you've probably had to wait with your parent while your older brother and sister is finishing up their practice. Now, no matter who you are, every single person can tell you what this is. let me do. I'll just play it because it'll be a wee bit of fun for me anyway. Everybody knows that. So as a young beginner drummer, you want to play that because you've heard it. What is that? What is that? What is that? Reid, what is that? When are you going to teach us that? And so you do. And every piper would know what that is because they would say, oh yeah, that's the thing that the drummers play before we start the tune. So everybody recognizes that. It's also an easy roll. And so I try to teach them little simple things like that first. So after I get them through all the really basic stuff, singles, doubles, paradiddles, get them into stuff like that. And I try to come up with, I'm not a big theory guy. So I'm not going to teach you to play a three-pace roll, for example, by doing things like this: 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet, 5. I'm not going to do that. Why? Because it's boring. Why is it boring? It's because it reminds the young student of being in math class at school. Not saying that there's anything wrong with that, but you don't want to take them back to that place. I want to have you in this class, which is the cool class. So I try and come up with things to say, and I try and change that depending on which country and that I'm teaching in. So for example, I just started my young grandson 3 lessons ago, 7 years old, 3-pace rolls. But we don't call it 3-pace rolls. We call it elephants and kangaroos. All right. So he's learning to play elephants and kangaroos. Elephants bicycle faster than kangaroos hop. Elephants bicycle faster than kangaroos hop. And that's it. Now, you tell me, if you're 7, right, and you're into Lego and stuff, what's more cool? 1 triplet, 2 triplet, 3 triplet, 4 triplet stop, or elephants bicycle faster than kangaroos hop? You tell me which one of them is going to hook a 7-year-old in, right? Where they're, you know, like half the time when my grandson's getting a lesson, I have to keep telling him or reminding him not to put his drumstick up his nose, for crying out loud, you know. But when he gets to play elephants and kangaroos, he could do it because, and it's cool, and he gets to say it. And I think that that's a neat way to engage them. And then when you take that into scores, so in a few months' time, he'll be probably learning Old MacDonald had a farm, E-I-E-I, you know, something like that, so that he'll play that to something that he knows. I mean,
he can feel it.
Yes, exactly. He has a Scottish granddad here, okay, but his dad is half Scottish and his mom is Japanese. So he doesn't, and he hasn't really grown up with what I grew up with and what my sons grew up with, because they would come to all the competitions and stuff like that. So I think that that's an important way to do it. I always say, you'll, again, because we go back so long, trying to hook a kid is harder today because there's so many things that kids can get themselves into. So what I try to teach kids is this, that learning to play drums is the coolest thing in the world, because every kid 7 years and older, they're not interested in doing anything other than one thing: cool. And if the person teaching them can sell them that this is absolutely super cool, and by doing this, you're going to be the cool kid in class, the cool kid, the cool person, cool whatever, they'll do it, because kids are not interested in playing drums, pipes, trumpets, guitars, but they're all interested in being cool. And so my job is, I'm going to make this drumming so cool that you are going to practice it because you keep learning cool things. And then when you get them, your job's done, because then they keep coming back for more. You know, right. When am I going to get a new score? What's going to be in the new score? Have you got a new rudiment? You know, that really enthusiastic kid that you would get, you know? So you've got to teach them about cool.
Interesting. Very good.
Trying to latch them.
Yeah, that's a good concept. When and how do you introduce music, the reading of music, into the progression?
Well, I don't get overly caught up in that. As I said earlier, I'm not a big theory guy. I do believe that it's important, okay, to learn to read music, but I will start to put things down show them how things look on paper after they've learned to play it as a rudiment. So once you've learned your elephants and kangaroos, I'll then put it down on paper later. But I want to see if you can get it first, and then we'll worry about that stuff as we go along. Okay. And then, so then I start to introduce them to the music. A lot of people find the music is actually, they get most of it really quite simple. It's not all that hard for them to pick up. One of the things I find with drummers, pretty much all drummers, at least 95% of them, is sometimes they have a difficulty determining what is the value of the roll. You know, like they see the tie and all that kind of stuff. So quite simply, what I would do is I would do this. I just hand them a score, and it's got all the roll values in red ink, so that when they print it off in color, it's there. And so if that helps them recognize that, Reid doesn't care, as long as you play it right. And then eventually they don't need it to be highlighted like that. But at the same time, I don't want to see a youngster being discouraged because they can't figure out whether it's a 7 to 6 stroke roll or it's a 10 stroke roll to a 10 or whatever combination you can get. Oh, I just want them to play it. There's a slight sidebar to this, Jim, but I'm a big fan of blues, and I've always been a fan of the great late guitarist Stevie Ray Vaughan. On one of his albums, it's one of the albums that came out on a CD. It was a digitally remastered one, so you know they took the old album and they cleaned it up even more, but they put a couple of hidden tracks at the very end of it, and one of them is he's interviewed, and it asks him about reading music, and he said that when he tried to read the music, he always felt like he was playing to the bar line and then to the bar line and to the bar line, and he couldn't get the flow. And I think that I respond well to that statement. At the end of the day, I don't really care if you can, how well you can read and how you're picking it up. I played in a band where we were all taught by ear and by eye, and we did quite well, winning 4 drumming titles over the course of 6 years and 2 World Pipe Band Championships. And not one note was ever put down to paper.
That was quite common back in the day.
Yes, absolutely it was. And I like the way that it's all progressed. You know, I spend more time a day reading and writing out music than I do using the English language, whether it be to type or whether it be to write, you know. But I just think that I think it's important, and but it's not the be all and end all. And I mean, I always say to people that I know several musicians who cannot read and write, and they don't play in pipe bands. Paul McCartney, Stevie Wonder, Stevie Ray Vaughan, Ray Charles. What do they all have in common? They can't read. Now, and I don't use Stevie Wonder's name in a bad way. I just mean that guy has been blind his entire life, but what a fabulous musician. I mean, and the things that he has composed as a musician, that's okay. It doesn't matter. It's just how you pass it on. And I mean, if you look at pipe band music or music that's played on the pipes that now pipe bands play, a lot of it back in the day would have been passed on by listening and watching. And so that's still an important component. I think that some people can be great at playing things off a chart, but no emotion. Mm-hmm. So it's all here, but there's nothing here in the heart, you know. And I think, well, music, I've never really thought about music other than being something that moves you emotionally, really.
I always tried to get as quickly as we could off the music because I think, and I was told once, that you can tell a story a lot more exciting than you can read a story.
Yeah, yeah. That's a great. I'll use that. I'll use that. I'll
As long as you
definitely
give me credit.
absolutely. I'll say my good friend from Chicago, Jim Sam, says you can read a story, but it's more exciting to tell a story. Brilliant.
You were a great solo player as well. Maybe you can talk a little bit about two things. One is things you would maybe recommend to solo players, how they can improve their solo performance. And then secondly, how do you handle solo efforts or solo playing within the band? Does everybody work on that separately, or are you there with them, or how do you handle that?
First of all, thanks for the very flattering statement about being a great solo player. I've never actually really considered myself to be a great solo player. I like to play solos back in the day because I just love to drum. But I've never ever thought myself as that guy. Like, but I do like to play. When it comes to guys in the core, they sometimes come to me for scores, obviously, or they'll come and they'll say, "Hey, JR, I'm going to go and play in the gold medal. Can I come over and let you have a listen?" And I do that. I never impose myself on them. They know I'm here as a resource. If they want to come, they'll come to me. I like to try and encourage people to get out and play because I think that it's a good way to put your own personal play under a spotlight. And while you're young, you never know what might unfold for you. You might become the person that breaks Stephen McWhirter's record of so many world championships, or Jim Kilpatrick's record of, I think Jim's holds the record of like 16 in a row. And Stephen McWhirter looks like he's getting closer all the time. Well, of course, every time he wins one, it gets closer. But I mean, he's still got several to go to get to that number, whatever that number is. I do think it's 16. So I always wonder if this is the next one, the next great player. And I try to get them to think. You won't be surprised by that, but I try to get them to think about the music. And I try to get them to think about when they're playing in band, you've got the bass section, the bass, the tenors, and you've got pipers using harmony and stuff like that. And they're selling a story. And then when you come to the solo event, it's you, a piper, a drum, and a drummer. How are you going to sell that point? How are you going to do that? And some of the things we've already spoken about today, don't go over the top. If you've got a cute little lick that you want to put in because you can play it and it kind of works for you there, that's fine. Grant does that a bit with my scores. He'll alter the odd wee thing. He'll put a wee thing in that he thinks might be solo appropriate. And every now and again, I give him heck for it. But most of the times, it's quite tastefully done. And I'll say to him, "Hey, I quite like what you did with that there." I said, it's not something that I would try to do in band. And sometimes it's not what I would have done in band because I never thought of it because he's thinking, But sometimes it's also because I don't need to think about that in the band because I've got the bass and the tenor drummers all doing stuff, And so if there's one thing I hope I'm not taken the wrong way when I say this to younger players today, but I hear I need to play a lot of notes. And when I say that, I mean a lot of staccato notes, So there's lots of, but there's not, where people don't realize that in a 13-stroke roll, there's 13 strokes. That's why it gets its name. And so if you play it, it's a cop-out because it's a roll, or, like the great James King's chorus of the Dysart and Dundonald era that I played in, if we didn't play rolls, well, what would we have played?
Mm-hmm.
That was their bread and butter, was roll combinations. So I think that finding nice tunes and tunes that you like, like for example, with youngsters, I'll give them tunes at certain levels, grade 4 level, grade 3 level, grade 2 level. But once they start to get junior, senior year in high school and they're playing at a higher level, I like them to ask me what they would like to play. Reid, I'm thinking about playing this. Do you have a score for this? Or I got a hold of a Stephen McQuarter score for this. Or I went to the Gordon and Tom Brown book and I saw a score here. Do you think I could? I like them to go and attach themselves to stuff, because then they'll bring out music that they like because they like that tune. Who am I to say that, oh, I've got a great tune for you, you'll love it. And it's like, love it? Oh my God, you know. It happens. Yeah. You just don't know, and so I think that that's important, and try and do things really well, fundamentally, and then once you can do things fundamentally, then you can expand on them. But you've got to, you know, I'm still trying to improve. You know, I'm still trying to improve as a musician. You know, my hands are all good and all that kind of stuff, but I'm still trying to improve. I'm still trying to be a better player. And more than anything, I'm trying to be a better teacher, so that when I start 2021, I'll be a better teacher than I was when I started 2020. Because I've just, you know, I've researched some stuff and wondered why, you know, like I'm always looking at the why.
Yeah. So just to kind of bring everything to a conclusion, maybe a couple of things you could say to young drummers, young bands, lower grade bands. What can they do to help improve their overall playing individually and as bands? And I think you've said a lot already. Maybe just give us a summation of that.
Seek help. And there's a lot of good help. And it's all at your fingertips. It's easy to get. If one thing that COVID has maybe taught people is that online learning is not so frightening. I've been teaching people online for well over 20 years now. And, you know, so you can get help anywhere. Ask from experts about tunes. Ask about the degree of difficulty. Is this too, do you think this my band can handle this? Do you think my drum corps can handle it? Do you think my pipe corps can handle it? Think about things. There's quite a lot of excellent people who are incredibly knowledgeable, who probably barely get asked. You know, and I think there's a great resource out there. Ask drummers when it comes to compositions. You know, just because you're the lead drummer of a band doesn't mean that you have to be the composer of the scores for that band. You know, I remember way back in the day when young players like John Scullion and Jim Kilpatrick were vying for the crown of world solo drumming champion, and they were playing Donald Cameron, Cameronian Rant, and Pretty Marion, written by the master himself, Alec Dysart. You know, like those people became great players because they learned great material from great players, and then they used that base of music and drumming artistry to craft their own thing as they moved forward. They didn't just happen upon it. And I think that there's a lot there, and continue to learn. I mean, I learned a lot about pipe music and tunes, not from drummers, but from talking to pipers. I learned an awful lot from Tom Anderson, who was the pipe major of the Peel Regional Police Pipe Band when I was the lead drummer there for a couple of seasons. And prior to being the lead drummer there, I had taught the drummers at that band for a wee while as well. And I was always fascinated by Tommy's insight, because I always felt like he was teaching me quite a bit about the music. One of the great things I always remembered, or I re-remembered when I heard an interview just about a year ago from the late Bob Shepherd, and that was that music is something that moves forward, and nothing drives it forward more than what the drums can do to the music. I never forgot that. And I guess you could say that in my early days at the 78th Fraser Highlanders, it was maybe there a little bit too much because there was no lack of drive and excitement in the tempo. Tempo's not everything, but it's, you know, it's very important. And I think that that aspect is really, really important. And learn the music, learn about the music. You know, like if you're going to play, for example, a wee march medley set, look up the tunes, but find them by singers or fiddle players or accordion players, like the great Jimmy Shand, for example, or Bobby McLeod, a tremendous accordion player. Really, you know, like there's nuances in how they deliver things that the bagpipe doesn't allow you to do. But from the nuances, you might find something that you would do in a score that would complement that. And when you put it together, you've got a better end product, you know?
Definitely. And you say if people, they should improve and reach out. If I know both yourself and your son Grant give lessons online, if they wanted to reach out to you for some help, how could they reach you?
Yeah, just email me or reach out to me on Facebook. Either or, I'm quite easy to get a hold of, you know. So Reid Max, JREIDMAX @yahoo.com is a good way. Or you can get a hold of me at Reid at Taking No Shortcuts, which is the name of my wee book that I teach from, that's got an abundance of rudiments in it. And so, or just drop me a line. And if you didn't catch any of that, send the band an email and they'll forward it to me, you know?
Yeah, and you are on Facebook, I know, so they can reach out to you that way too.
Yeah, absolutely. If you want to, the best way to get a hold of me is Messenger. If you want to send me a message on Messenger, that's my thing. I'm told that the young'uns don't use Messenger. Apparently, it's too old-fashioned now. Who knew? Who knew? You know, who knew? But anyway, if you want to get a hold of me, I use that because I find it easy. It's easy for me. That's it. That's why I use it. So if you wanted to get a hold of me, that's the best.
And I can just say, as a good friend with Reid for a long time, what he says he does, and he's the most straight shooting guy I've ever met, I think, and he will improve your playing. Period. End. We used to have Reid come into the band almost annually. I think he used to come make that trip to Chicago for a long weekend, and I learned an awful lot from you, and I thank you for that.
Well, you're very welcome.
And it's always a good pleasure to talk with you. And thank you very much for doing this. I think this will be a great resource for everyone here in the Midwest. And all the best and stay safe.
Jim, thanks. And thanks very much for the invitation in the first place to do it. Thank you so much. Thanks.
Thank you, Reid.